He didn't raise his voice. He didn't resist. He simply asked why he was being pulled over. But within minutes, Marcus Ellington, a well-dressed black man, was dragged from his car, thrown in jail, and labeled a threat. He stayed silent, not out of fear, but with purpose. Because Marcus wasn't just any man. He was a federal prosecutor, and they had no idea. When the truth came out in court, the entire room froze. What happens when the system tries to crush the one man who knows exactly how it works? If this story makes you stop and think, hit like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe. Now let's step into the courtroom where silence becomes the sharpest weapon. It was just past 11 p.m. when Marcus Ellington turned off the main highway onto a quiet service road outside Baton Rouge. The glow of the street lamps stretched long over the pavement, the air still warm from a southern night. He was heading home after a farewell dinner with colleagues at the U.S. Attorney's office. Nothing fancy, just a few heartfelt speeches, clinking glasses, and a promise of rest after decades of service. For once, he wasn't thinking about indictments or depositions. His mind was quiet. His phone was off. And for the first time in months, he felt still. That stillness didn't last. The headlights appeared behind him without warning, drawing closer until they clung to his rear bumper. Then came the flash of red and blue, sudden, sharp, urgent. He felt it before he understood it. That old familiar drop in the gut. He eased the car to the shoulder and placed both hands on the wheel. There was no panic. He wasn't speeding. His registration was up to date. His car had just passed inspection. But Marcus Ellington had prosecuted enough civil rights cases to know reason wasn't always the reason. As he waited, he glanced in the mirror. 2 white officers approached. The one on the driver's side moved like someone who owned every inch of space he stepped on. Broad-shouldered, buzz-cut, chin out. Officer Craig Landon. His partner Derek Barnes kept to the passenger side, quieter but no less sure of himself. Landon knocked hard on the window. Marcus rolled it down smoothly. "Good evening, officer. License and registration." The voice was clipped, not aggressive, just clinical, like a man checking off boxes. Marcus handed over the documents. "May I ask why I was stopped?" Landon looked over his shoulder at Barnes before answering. "Your taillight's out." Marcus blinked. That wasn't true. He'd had the car inspected 5 days ago. He'd seen the reflection on the back wall of the garage just this morning. Still, he said nothing about that. Not yet. "I see," he said calmly. "Are you sure?" Landon's jaw tightened just slightly. "Step out of the vehicle." The tone changed, not louder, but heavier. Marcus felt it in his chest. That sudden shift. The kind of shift you don't question unless you're ready for what follows. "With all respect, officer," he said, "I'd like to understand the lawful reason for—" "Step out. Now." Landon interrupted, eyes flat. Barnes moved closer, one hand on his belt hovering. Not subtle. Marcus's mind raced, but his voice stayed even. "Officers, I'm within my rights to ask." He didn't finish the sentence. Landon yanked the door open and grabbed Marcus by the wrist. The seatbelt caught across his chest as he was pulled sideways, shoulder-twisted knee banging into the frame. "Hey," Marcus snapped, instinct taking over. "What are you doing?" Barnes rounded the car and reached through the opposite door, dragging Marcus's other arm out. Cold metal cuffs bit into his wrists before he could blink. "You're resisting," Landon said. "I'm not resisting anything," Marcus replied sharply, but they weren't listening. They pulled him out, fully slammed him onto the hood of the car. The metal burned through his shirt. One of them drove a forearm into his back, not enough to bruise, but enough to humiliate. The other pressed down on his lower leg to keep him still. A car slowed behind them, headlights washing over the scene. For a moment, Marcus thought the driver might stop, say something, record something. But the car rolled past without a sound. There was no struggle. Marcus didn't shout, didn't beg. He simply lay still, breathing through his nose, face turned toward the trees beyond the ditch. He had spent a lifetime learning how to stay composed. He knew the law. He'd built his career inside courtrooms, explaining that law to juries defending it against corruption. But he also knew the law didn't always protect men who looked like him. This time he wasn't standing behind a podium. He wasn't holding a brief. He wasn't in a suit and tie with a judge's respect. He was just a black man pulled over in the dark. And they didn't see anything else. As Landon adjusted the cuffs, tightening them just because he could, Marcus exhaled, eyes steady. Then softly, almost conversationally, he asked one question. "Are you sure you want to do this?" The words floated into the air and hung there unanswered. No one replied. Not Landon, not Barnes, not the stars overhead. Only the slow creak of leather, the rattle of keys, and the sound of a man refusing to break even as the system tried to silence him. Because Marcus knew exactly what this was, and more importantly, he knew exactly what came next. They didn't drive fast. The cruiser moved steady through the quiet streets, the city lights flickering across the windshield like nothing had happened. Marcus sat in the back seat, hands cuffed, head tilted slightly toward the window, listening to the low hum of the engine and the static on the police radio. No one spoke. Landon didn't look back. Barnes didn't look over. And Marcus, despite everything, didn't say a word. His body ached from where they'd slammed him against the hood, but that wasn't what sat heavy in his chest. What pressed down was the familiarity of it all, the knowing, the repetition. He had spent decades studying this system, fighting inside it, and now he was in the belly of it. The booking desk was under fluorescent lights so harsh they turned skin gray. The air smelled of bleach and old paper. A young officer behind the glass looked up as they walked Marcus in, but didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. They brought in people like him all the time. Landon passed over paperwork, muttering codes and charges like they were ordering lunch. Barnes stood off to the side, arms crossed, eyes scanning the floor. Marcus cleared his throat. "I'd like to make a phone call." No one answered. He tried again. "I have the right to contact counsel." One call. The desk officer looked up, then down again. Landon shrugged. "We'll get to it." They didn't. Instead, Marcus was led down a narrow hallway into holding. A long corridor lined with metal doors, each painted a pale, sickly blue. The sergeant on duty didn't even glance at the paperwork, just looked Marcus over and smirked. Well, well. Another loudmouth black man in a suit cute. Marcus didn't respond. He could have. He had 100 things he could have said, but he didn't. Because he knew what was happening. He'd seen it too many times, just never from this side of the bars. They walked past a bench where a white teenager sat, no cuffs, sipping water from a paper cup. He couldn't have been more than 20, wearing a college hoodie and texting casually on his phone. As they passed, the kid looked up at Marcus, then looked away, unbothered. The door to the cell creaked open. The concrete room was lit with a buzzing ceiling light that flickered every few seconds like it was struggling to stay awake. A thin mattress sat on a metal slab. No pillow, no blanket, just a stained piece of foam. The walls smelled like damp laundry that had been left too long in the machine. Someone had scratched words into the corner of the wall. They were too faded to read. The door closed behind him with a metallic thunk. No one said anything. No one had to. Marcus sat down slowly, easing onto the mattress, his spine tight from the tension. The cuffs had been removed, but his wrists were raw. He looked down at them, then let his hands rest on his knees. Across from him, the metal toilet sat in full view of the hallway. Privacy didn't exist here. Minutes passed. Maybe an hour. There was no clock. No sense of time. Just the buzzing light and the distant sound of keys jangling as guards moved back and forth down the hall. From inside that room, he could hear another man coughing, someone shouting nonsense, someone else whispering prayers. But no one called for help. Not anymore. Marcus leaned back against the wall, breathing through his nose, trying to slow his heart. And without meaning to, his mind slipped somewhere he didn't expect. He thought of Jordan, his cousin. They grew up 3 streets apart. Marcus had gone into law school, Jordan into construction. A stoplight, a missed turn, and one night Jordan ended up on the pavement under a flashlight, accused of refusing to follow orders. He'd been pushed into the system, charged with obstruction, spent 6 months inside waiting for a court date that never came. By the time he got out, he wasn't the same. He smiled less, talked softer. 2 years later, he took his own life in the bathroom of his mother's house. Marcus had read that police report. The phrasing was familiar, the language clean. The officers said Jordan had been non-compliant. Marcus knew what that meant. It meant someone didn't like how he looked at them. It meant someone felt threatened by his existence. And now here Marcus sat, on the same slab, under the same flickering light. It didn't matter that he was a federal prosecutor. It didn't matter that he'd worn a badge delivered justice upheld the law. In this place, in this moment, he was just a black man in a cage. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, letting the silence press in around him. His eyes didn't water, but something deep in his chest felt tight. Not fear, not rage, just a heavy, hollow ache. His lips moved quietly, almost like a prayer, though there was no one to hear it but the walls. I spent my life defending justice, but tonight I am just a black man behind bars. And somewhere down the hall, another man laughed. No one came. No one offered water. No one asked his name. And still Marcus waited. Because he knew this wasn't the end. This was just the middle. The courtroom was colder than it looked, not in temperature, but in spirit. You could feel it the moment Marcus was brought in, his wrists cuffed in front of him, the orange jumpsuit swallowing his posture like a warning sign no one would question. He didn't look around. He didn't scan the benches or glance toward the gallery. He already knew what was there. He just walked slow and calm until the guard guided him to the defense table. His chair squeaked slightly as he sat. It was the only sound in the room. Rosa Chen was already there. Mid-30s, sharp-eyed, carrying a folder that looked too light for what she was about to face. She greeted Marcus with a quick nod, a flicker of something like apology in her eyes. She was doing her best. She was also drowning. She leaned toward him and whispered, "We don't have body cam footage, and they're refusing to release the dispatch logs until next week." Marcus didn't flinch. He just nodded once, his hands folded in front of him, palms flat. He looked more like a judge than a defendant. Judge Beatrice Callahan entered next, mid-60s, white, stiff-backed, her expression unreadable, carved from years of carrying the gavel like a weapon. She didn't sit right away. She paused, scanned the room, then settled behind the bench like someone returning to her favorite seat in a play she'd already seen too many times. She didn't look at Marcus, not once. "Let's proceed," she said flatly, flipping open a file. The prosecutor was last to arrive, and he made sure everyone noticed. Alan Stokes, tan suit, perfect pocket square, the kind of man who smiled when nothing was funny and always walked like he was being filmed. He carried a thick binder not because he needed it, but because it looked impressive when he set it down. He glanced at Marcus and gave a small shake of the head like he was disappointed before a word had even been said. "Your Honor." Stokes began smoothly. "This is a simple case of a citizen escalating a routine traffic stop into a physical confrontation. The officers acted professionally. The defendant did not." Rosa stood adjusting her sleeves quickly. "Objection to the characterization. That is not a statement of fact." Judge Callahan didn't even look up. Overruled. Stokes didn't bother hiding his smile. He continued, unbothered. "There's no dispute about the events. The defendant refused lawful commands. He resisted. He was restrained. There were no injuries, no excessive force, no misconduct." Rosa raised her hand again. "There is no body cam footage. There is no third-party witness. My client has no history of violence or criminal behavior." Judge Callahan finally looked her way, but not kindly. "Is that relevant to whether he complied with a lawful order?" "I believe it is," Rosa replied carefully. "Pattern matters. Character matters. In this courtroom, the judge said facts matter. Proceed." Marcus sat still through all of it. His expression never shifted. His body didn't tense, but his eyes scanned the room, always moving, quietly studying. He saw how Stokes stood, confident, comfortable, like this room belonged to him. He noticed how the jury avoided looking his way, except for one older man in the back row who kept watching him like he was trying to decide if he believed in ghosts. He saw Maya Ricks, too, the young black journalist seated in the second row. She didn't look like she was here for a quick story. She didn't fidget or scroll her phone. She wrote slowly, deliberately, as if she knew the words she captured might matter later. At one point, she looked up directly at Marcus, and their eyes locked. He didn't nod. He didn't smile. But something in his gaze told her he wasn't what they were painting him to be. Rosa kept fighting. She asked for time. She asked for access. She asked for fairness. And Judge Callahan gave her exactly what the system was built to offer: polite dismissal. The proceedings moved fast, too fast. Witness lists were denied. Motions were tabled. Every objection fell like a stone into a well soundless gone before it landed. Marcus said nothing. Not yet. He sat through it all still as a stone, letting the tide pull forward, because he knew something they didn't. This wasn't the moment that mattered. That moment was still coming. and when it arrived, it would not be quiet. When Officer Landon took the stand, he didn't look nervous. He sat tall in the witness chair, legs spread just slightly, one hand resting on his thigh like he had done this before. His badge caught the courtroom light polished to a shine, and for a moment, if you didn't know any better, you might believe you were looking at a man who had nothing to hide. The oath had barely left his mouth when he leaned into the microphone and began. The suspect refused multiple lawful orders. He said, his voice clear and confident. We asked him to exit the vehicle. He declined. We asked again. He questioned us. That's when we recognized the situation was escalating. Stokes stood off to the side, nodding like a proud coach watching a star player run a practiced play. Judge Callahan showed no reaction. She didn't even glance up from the paper in front of her. Rosa rose slowly, arms crossed in front of her. Officer Landon, she said, steady but respectful. Was the traffic stop recorded in any way? Landon hesitated just for a beat. No, ma'am. The body cameras were not functioning that evening. And dash cam, also unavailable, technical malfunction. Rosa nodded once. So there's no objective record of the interaction? No, ma'am. Landon replied this time with a small shrug. But our written reports were filed immediately and reflect the facts accurately. Marcus sat still at the defense table. He didn't shift. He didn't blink more than once. He watched Landon speak as though watching a play unfold that he had seen 100 times before, because in many ways he had. Stokes stepped forward again, calling the second officer Derek Barnes. Barnes was less theatrical than Landon. He spoke softly with pauses, almost like he was searching for words that would sound measured and credible. I remember feeling the tension in the moment, he said. Mr. Ellington tensed up when Officer Landon asked him to exit the car. I placed my hand near my weapon because I feared he might reach for something. You feared for your safety? Stokes asked. Yes, absolutely. No sudden movements from him. Barnes paused again. Not sudden, but there was a hesitation, a resistance. Not physical at first, but verbal. He wouldn't comply. Rosa stood again. Officer Barnes did. Mr. Ellington raised his voice. Threaten you in any way? No, but he challenged our authority. Did he have any weapon on him? No, ma'am. Any aggressive gesture. I don't know how you define aggressive, but it was the energy, the non-compliance, the tension. The tension, Rosa repeated. Thank you, officer. She let it hang in the air for a moment before walking back to her table. Then she stepped forward again. Your Honor, may I speak? Judge Callahan looked up with that tired, mechanical expression that said she already knew what was coming and didn't particularly care for it. You may, she said. There is no body cam, no dash cam, no third-party witness, no medical report of injury, no radio log indicating heightened threat. There is only testimony from 2 officers, both of whom failed to activate required recording equipment during a routine stop, and whose accounts rely on words like energy and tension, rather than objective facts. She paused. The silence was weighty but not heavy enough. I respectfully ask the court to consider whether testimony unsupported by evidence can rise to the level of justification for force and detainment. Stokes was already rising before she finished. Your Honor, this line of argument undermines the sworn statements of 2 career officers. Are we now saying officer testimony is meaningless unless there's video? Judge Callahan didn't hesitate. Officer testimony is sufficient, she said, almost bored. The objection is noted and overruled. And just like that, it was sealed. That phrase landed like a gavel before the real one ever did. Officer testimony is sufficient. Not evidence, not proof, just words from a uniformed man who knew how to phrase them properly. Marcus didn't move. His face gave away nothing. But inside the room had grown colder. Not because of fear, but because of how familiar this all was. He had stood in rooms like this before, not as the accused, but as the government's voice. He had heard stories fall apart under the weight of the truth. But now truth had no place here. This wasn't about facts. This was performance. And the stage had already been set. The jury looked unmoved. A few shifted in their chairs, scribbled notes blinked slowly. But no one seemed surprised. No one leaned forward. It was as if they too had seen this show before. Stokes walked back to his seat, smug and silent. Rosa sat beside Marcus and let out a slow breath. I'm sorry, she whispered. I don't think they're going to listen. Marcus didn't answer, because she wasn't wrong, but he wasn't ready to speak. Not yet. Inside the narrow defense room, the air was still thick with the weight of quiet defeat. Rosa Chen sat across from Marcus. Her shoulders slightly hunched, her legal pad resting on her knees untouched. Her voice barely rose above a whisper as she finally said, "Marcus, I'm sorry." He didn't flinch. He didn't respond right away. He simply looked at her, his eyes calm but unreadable, as if the chaos outside the room couldn't reach him. "I tried." She continued, the words falling out fast like she had held them in too long. "I pushed for the footage. I challenged the testimonies. I cited every case I could. But Judge Callahan is not even pretending to be impartial, and Stokes is spinning fiction like it's fact." Marcus nodded slowly, but not out of agreement. It was more like acknowledgement. He had heard that tone before, disillusionment soaked in sincerity. He had worn it once too when he was much younger and far more hopeful. Then, with a breath that felt like it came from deep within, Marcus leaned back slightly and began to speak. Not to argue, not to plan, just to share. "I lost my first trial," he said. "It was a boy, 14, black, scared, charged with assaulting an officer because he flinched when someone grabbed him." Rosa's eyes lifted slowly, as if she hadn't expected a story. But she listened. "I was fresh out of law school. I believed if I just presented the facts, told the truth, the system would do the rest." He paused, and something in his gaze flickered. The jury took 2 hours to convict him. 2 hours to decide that fear looked like guilt. Rosa whispered, "What happened to him?" "He served a year in juvie," Marcus replied. "Came out quieter, jumpier. He was gone within 6 months. Suicide. They said it was depression. I knew better. It was hopelessness." The room fell silent again, but it wasn't empty anymore. It was full of something heavier, something more intimate. Not sympathy, but understanding. "That boy," Rosa said softly, "he could have been my student, or my cousin. They always say the law is blind, but sometimes it just refuses to look." Marcus allowed himself a faint smile, not of joy, but of recognition. Rosa was young, green, but she had more in her than she realized. "I've waited years for the right case," he said, his voice steady. "Not the right judge, not the right jury, the right moment. And this might be it." Rosa studied him, really studied him for the first time. Not the handcuffs, not the jumpsuit, but the way he carried himself, the way he seemed untouched by the mud they kept throwing at him. "You're not who they think you are," she said quietly. "I'm exactly who they think I am," Marcus replied. "They just don't know what that means yet." Outside the door, the hallway buzzed faintly with courtroom footsteps and the echo of a gavel. Somewhere nearby, a clerk called out a docket number. But inside this room, it felt like the world had slowed to a crawl, giving space for something rare to grow. Trust. Rosa looked down at her legal pad, then up again. "If we fight this, really fight this, they'll come harder. They'll dig into everything you've ever done." "I know," Marcus said. "They might win." He didn't answer that right away. Instead, he said, "They've already lost. They just don't see it yet." She exhaled slowly, then leaned forward with a quiet determination that hadn't been there before. "Then we'll make them see it." Marcus gave her a small nod of respect. "Good." He stood, and the chains on his wrists rattled slightly, but he didn't seem smaller for it. In fact, he seemed taller now, somehow. Not just a defendant in a jumpsuit, a man who knew exactly what storm was coming and had chosen to walk into it. As the door opened and the officer gestured for them to return, Rosa reached for her files, but not with defeat anymore. She wasn't carrying weight, she was carrying purpose. And Marcus, as he walked past the cold stairs and whispered doubts in the hallway, carried silence like a blade waiting to strike. The time for words would come soon enough, but not yet. Not yet. It was late morning when the bailiff called the next witness, and all eyes turned to Rosa, expecting her to call another minor character from the list. But instead, Marcus rose from the defense table and spoke clearly, asking the court's permission to testify on his own behalf. The room shifted. Chairs creaked. Judge Callahan blinked with annoyance, not entirely hiding his displeasure. "Against your counsel's advice," the judge asked. Rosa, still seated, gave the faintest nod. "He insists." Callahan shrugged. "Very well. Proceed." Marcus walked to the witness stand in the quiet way that only confident men know how to do. Not hurried, not timid, just deliberate, like each step belonged to someone who had already seen where the path led. He sat. The clerk swore him in. And then, with the weight of the courtroom pressing in on him, Marcus folded his hands, leaned slightly forward, and waited. Prosecutor Alan Stokes stood, his smirk barely contained. He walked toward Marcus like a man circling prey he had already wounded. "Mr. Ellington," he began, "you claim this was a routine drive home, yet you were out late in a government vehicle wearing no identification and failed to comply with clear police instructions. Would you say that's responsible behavior for a citizen?" Marcus tilted his head slightly, his voice steady. "Are you asking me as a citizen or as a federal prosecutor?" Stokes narrowed his eyes. "Excuse me." Marcus reached into the pocket of the jumpsuit he had insisted on wearing, not because he had to, but because he chose to walk the same road so many before him had walked unjustly. From it, he drew a small black leather wallet. He opened it and placed it on the ledge of the witness stand for all to see. "Marcus Ellington," he said, loud enough for the courtroom to hold its breath. "Assistant United States Attorney, badge number 3275. The room froze. Stokes took a step back. A murmur ran through the audience. Even Judge Callahan's gavel hung mid-air like his hand forgot what it was supposed to do. Rosa's eyes went wide. Maya, the reporter in the gallery, sat up straight and leaned forward, scribbling notes so fast her pen nearly tore through the page. Stokes opened his mouth to speak, but only managed a dry, stunned breath. Marcus remained calm, his expression unchanged. He let the silence stretch for just long enough. "I did not disclose my position until now," he continued, "because I needed to know how far this system would go. What it would do to a man with no voice, no title, no shield." He turned slightly, not to face Stokes or the judge, but to the room. "Every day in this country, men and women without badges or connections are pulled over, locked up, silenced, and discarded. I needed to feel that not as a lawyer, but as a black man in America." Stokes, recovering slightly, tried to pivot. "Your position does not exempt you from lawful orders, Mr. Ellington." "No," Marcus replied, "but it does allow me access to certain records, such as the full radio log from that evening's patrol, which I've requested, and which I'm sure will show discrepancies in the officer's statements." Judge Callahan shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Ellington, are you submitting that now?" "I am requesting it be entered into the record," Marcus said evenly. "It will clarify whether any lawful order was actually given, and whether I was stopped for a broken taillight or because two officers saw a black man in a suit and decided that was threat enough." The judge looked like he might object, but thought better of it. Marcus looked again toward the jury. "You thought I was just another case," he said quietly. "But this time the case is watching you." There was no applause, no gasp, just the kind of silence that means something has changed. Something permanent, something undeniable. And for the first time since this trial began, Marcus didn't look like a man under pressure. He looked like the one applying it. The judge cleared his throat, trying to regain control. "We will recess for 15 minutes while the prosecution responds." As the gavel came down, Rosa turned to Marcus with eyes wide as if seeing him for the very first time. And Marcus, rising from the stand, didn't look at her or at Stokes. He looked toward the courtroom doors. Beyond them, he knew the real reckoning was waiting. But now the mask was off. The table had turned, and the badge was already on it. There was a different air in the courtroom after the recess. Not just tension, but discomfort, like the walls themselves had heard too much, and were unsure whether to hold the truth in or let it echo. Judge Callahan returned to the bench with less of his earlier arrogance. His hands fidgeted slightly as he adjusted his robe, as though the fabric no longer fit right. He cleared his throat and addressed the courtroom. "The request to retrieve the radio dispatch logs from the night in question is granted. The material will be reviewed and admitted accordingly." He said it quickly, almost as if he hoped no one was really listening. But they were. Everyone was. Because everyone knew what this meant. If there was no record of a traffic stop, no lawful order, then there was no legal justification for what happened to Marcus. Officer Landon, who had up to this point carried himself like the courtroom belonged to him, suddenly shifted in his seat. His mouth tightened. His eyes glanced across the aisle, and then for the first time he looked unsure. He leaned toward Barnes and whispered, but it wasn't quite a whisper. "Not when fear has started to rot the edges of your control." "Did you file it?" he asked. Barnes stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, eyes cold. Then, without moving his head, he gave the slightest shake. No words. Just silence that screamed. The prosecutor, Alan Stokes, stood slowly, his body stiffer than it had been just minutes earlier. He knew the weight of this shift. The badge had changed everything, but this was evidence. And evidence does not explain itself away. Meanwhile, at the back of the room, Maya Ricks tapped her fingers across her phone. Her expression was still, but her screen glowed with purpose. The headline she was preparing was not subtle. She had written it in her mind the moment Marcus revealed his badge, but now, with the judge's reluctant approval and the officer's visible discomfort, she knew it would spread like fire. Within seconds of hitting, publish notifications started popping up on her screen. Retweets, shares, mentions. Her phone lit up like a Christmas tree. The world outside was listening now, and the courtroom was no longer a closed chamber. It was a spotlight. Judge Callahan noticed it too. His eyes flicked toward Maya's direction, a brief flash of resentment crossing his face. He had ruled over this courtroom like it was his kingdom for years. But today the walls had windows, and the people outside were watching. Rosa looked over at Marcus, her expression still tinged with awe. She leaned in just enough to whisper, "They're cracking. Do you see it?" Marcus didn't nod. He didn't speak, but the corners of his mouth lifted just enough for it to be called a smile. Not a wide grin, not arrogance, just a quiet knowing, the kind of smile that says, "I told you this wasn't over." He looked around the room slowly, at Landon, whose palms were starting to sweat, at Barnes, who had stopped meeting anyone's eyes, at Stokes, who suddenly had too many papers in his hands, and at Judge Callahan, who now seemed smaller behind the bench than he ever had before. This wasn't just about a bad arrest anymore. It wasn't just about Marcus. It was about what happens when the system finally meets someone who doesn't flinch. And for the first time in that courtroom, Marcus Ellington wasn't the one under scrutiny. The system was. T started with a headline, just 12 words typed by Maya Ricks in the back row of the courtroom as her fingers trembled and her eyes burned. Prosecutor arrested without cause. Judge ignores evidence. Baton Rouge boils. She didn't know what she was setting loose. Not really. But by the time she stepped outside, there were already people on the courthouse steps holding signs chanting Marcus Ellington's name like it meant something bigger than one man. And maybe it did. That night, Marcus sat at his desk in the holding area, no longer in a cell, but not yet free. His hands moved slowly over a yellow legal pad as he wrote line after line. No fancy words, no legal jargon, just truth. What if I didn't have a badge? Would I be buried by now? Would anyone know my name? The article Maya had posted was already on fire, shared thousands of times by people who didn't even live in Louisiana. Comments poured in, stories surfaced, and then came the leak. An anonymous email copied to Maya Rosa and half the local press. It contained internal memos between officers, one from Sergeant Allen in the precinct, time-stamped a week before Marcus's arrest. Reminder, if no clear offense, cite tail light. Stick to the script. Another said, make sure body cams malfunction on known troublemakers. And someone had highlighted a line in red. Black male in suit equals agitator. Proceed cautiously. Document intent early. When Rosa showed Marcus the emails, he didn't react at first. He just leaned back, looked at the ceiling, and exhaled like he had been carrying that weight for years. Then he asked for a pen. Maya was the one who cracked next. While sorting through photos from the protest, she paused on a face in the crowd. Young, maybe 18, curly hair, brown hoodie. Her eyes narrowed. She dug into her files, pulled out an old photo, and froze. Her brother, Jalen. The last time she saw him was 3 years ago, being cuffed by Officer Landon outside a gas station. The report had said resisting arrest, but there were no follow-ups, no trial, no trace, just silence. She stared at the image, hands shaking, heart racing. It wasn't just a story anymore. It never had been. By morning, the courthouse was surrounded, not by chaos, but by resolve. Veterans, teachers, single mothers, retired, judges, bus drivers. People from every corner of Baton Rouge stood shoulder to shoulder, holding candles, holding signs, holding space. One man held up a photo of his teenage daughter with a caption below. She was scared. They said that was enough. Another wore a shirt that read, "Justice wears no uniform." Inside, Marcus finished his letter and handed it to Rosa. "Publish it," he said softly. "Not as a prosecutor, as a citizen." She read it once, then twice, and without a word, she passed it to Maya. By noon. "What if I didn't have a badge" was everywhere. National news picked it up. Hashtags trended. Calls came in from advocacy groups and former attorneys general. The city's leadership issued a statement promising a full investigation, though their voices shook when asked about the leaked emails. But Marcus didn't smile this time. Not yet. The fight was only beginning. For every name that made the news, there were hundreds who didn't, and now the nation was listening. Finally, the courtroom felt different that morning. Not louder, not rowdier, just heavier, as if every breath, every rustle of paper or shifting of feet carried the weight of something that could not be taken back. The people sat in silence, eyes forward, waiting not just for a verdict, but for a reckoning. No cameras were allowed inside, but it didn't matter. Every soul in that room would carry what happened next in their memory, like a scar that never quite fades. Judge Callahan entered late. That alone was enough to set nerves humming. She moved slower than usual. Lips pursed, her hands stiff at her sides as she took her seat. The robe hung looser on her today, like it no longer fit the way it used to. She looked out over the courtroom, not with her usual impatience, but with something closer to weariness. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was low but clear. After reviewing the full record, including the recovered radio logs, internal communications, and sworn testimonies presented in this courtroom, she said, "This court finds the defendant, Marcus Ellington, not guilty on all charges." No applause erupted. No one dared move. It wasn't that the moment lacked power. It was that it felt sacred, like breaking the silence would somehow tarnish it. Judge Callahan didn't stop there. She paused, exhaled slowly, then continued. "This court recommends that all related files be forwarded to the Office of the State Attorney General for immediate review of potential civil rights violations." Her eyes flicked to the prosecution table, then to the back of the room where members of the press leaned forward, as if hearing history shift in real time. Landon exploded. "This is political," he shouted, rising from his seat. "You're all part of this circus. He baited us and you know it." The bailiff moved quickly, placing a firm hand on Landon's shoulder, but he shrugged it off and kept yelling. "I did my job. I followed orders." He wanted this to happen. Marcus didn't flinch. He sat still, hands folded, eyes steady. Landon's voice cracked as the bailiff finally forced him toward the side door. "You'll regret this," he spat, but by then no one was listening. Not really. Outside, the crowd waited in tense quiet, scanning the doors for a glimpse of the man they had come to believe in. When Marcus stepped out dressed not in a suit or uniform, but in a plain gray shirt and slacks, Maya raised her camera. She didn't ask him to pose. She didn't need to. He walked forward past the courthouse columns, past the seal of the state etched into the stone, and paused in front of the statue of blind justice, where the scales hung slightly askew from years of weather and wind. He looked up at it for a long moment, then looked straight ahead, chin lifted, eyes calm. Click. That was the photo. No words, no speech. Just a man standing still while the world caught up. By sundown, the image had spread everywhere. Newspapers printed it on front pages. Civil rights groups turned it into banners. One headline read, "The scales shift." Another simply, "He stood." But Marcus wasn't thinking about any of that. Not yet. As he walked down the steps with Rosa by his side and Maya a few paces behind, he kept his eyes forward. The fight was not over, but for the first time in weeks, his breath came easier. And deep down, he knew this wasn't just his vindication. It was for every voice that had ever been silenced, every truth buried under paperwork and power, every badge that had covered a lie. Justice hadn't roared. It had whispered. But this time it was loud enough to be heard. Marcus stepped through the heavy courthouse doors, not as a defendant, not as a man who had something to prove, but simply as himself. The sunlight fell across his face, and for a moment he stood still, letting it warm the chill that had clung to him since the night of his arrest. The crowd outside didn't cheer. They didn't chant or wave signs. Instead, as he walked past them, a hush swept over the street like a church right before the hymn, heads bowed, hands folded, not in protest, in quiet respect. He nodded to some of them barely just enough to say he saw them, that they mattered, that all of this, every hour in that courtroom, every insult swallowed in silence was for more than just clearing his name. It was for the silence they had all carried for too long. The city was buzzing, but Marcus didn't head home. He walked 3 blocks, then hailed a cab to the hospital, a place he had visited so many times without thinking. But now every hallway felt different, as if the walls themselves remembered who he had been before all of this began. When he stepped into the room, his mother lay still, the monitors beeping soft and steady like a lullaby. Her eyes were closed, face calm, but as he pulled up a chair beside her and took her hand, her fingers moved ever so slightly. Then her eyes opened. Just a sliver, just enough to find him. She smiled, not wide, not strong, but enough. "You did the right thing," she whispered, her voice barely audible, thin from days of sleep. No matter what they said, he couldn't answer right away. The knot in his throat wouldn't let him. He just held her hand, his own trembling now, but not from fear, from the weight of surviving something meant to break him. Later, he stood outside the hospital, leaning against the brick wall, the air thick with the smell of rain about to fall. Maya stood a few feet away, notebook tucked under her arm, her expression softer than he had seen it before. No questions, no pen in hand, just her as a witness. Marcus looked at her and said, "This wasn't a win. This was a warning." She nodded, not as a reporter, but as someone who finally understood that some stories aren't meant to end in victory, only in truth. The days that followed were loud. Press conferences, investigations reopened, resignations filed. But for Marcus, the noise faded into the background, because the real ending had nothing to do with politics or headlines. It came one quiet night when he sat alone in his study badge beside him on the desk light spilling onto a legal pad where he had begun to write. Not for the public, not for a case, just for the record. And in the stillness, his voice, so often muted by uniform and role, finally felt free. The final words of his letter weren't written for those who had watched him from afar. They were meant for someone who had never been seen at all. "The world only watched because I had a badge," he wrote. But what about the ones who don't? And in that question, the story didn't end. It only echoed. Sometimes justice is not loud. It is quiet. It is a man standing in silence, letting the truth speak for itself. This story reminds us that power does not always wear a uniform. Sometimes it sits quietly in a courtroom waiting for the right moment to rise. Marcus's journey was not just about clearing his name. It was about standing up for every voice that never got heard, every name that never made the news. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Mr. Max Stories for more powerful and meaningful tales like this one. Your support means more than you know. It is what fuels our team to keep telling stories that matter, stories that honor truth, dignity, and hope. And remember, at Mr. Max Stories, we do not just tell stories. We help you remember what should never be forgotten. Plap plus, plap, new nay.